Welcome to our podcast, and this week at London Visited, we go to the monument in the City of London to tell you all about this statue, the story behind it, and its significance to London. My name is Steve, and each week I will bring to you the facts, history, and information about different parts of this great capital. If you've been to London, are planning on visiting, live here, or just love London from afar, then this is the podcast for you. Don't forget to visit our YouTube channel, London Visited, to see videos covering this place and so many others across London. And now, to this week's podcast. The monument to the Great Fire of London, more commonly known simply as the Monument, is a Doric column in London, situated near the northern end of London Bridge. It commemorates the Great Fire of London and stands at the junction of Monument Street and Fish Street Hill, 202 feet, 62 metres, in height, and 202 feet west of the spot in Pudding Lane where the Great Fire of London started on the 2nd of September 1666. It was constructed between 1671 and 1677, and it was built on the site of St Margaret's, Fish Street, the first church to be destroyed by the Great Fire. It is Grade 1 listed and is a scheduled monument. Another monument, the Golden Boy of Pye Corner, marks the point near Smithfield where the fire was stopped. The monument comprises a fluted Doric column built of Portland stone, topped with a gilded urn of fire. It was designed by Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke. Its height marks its distance from the site of the shop of Thomas Fariner, or Firener, the King's Baker, where the blaze began. The viewing platform near the top of the monument is reached by a narrow winding staircase of 311 steps. A mesh cage was added in the mid-19th century to prevent people jumping to the ground, after 6 people had committed suicide there between 1788 and 1842. 3 sides of the base carry inscriptions in Latin. The one on the south side describes actions taken by King Charles II following the fire. The inscription on the east side describes how the monument was started and brought into perfection, and under which mayors. Inscriptions on the north side describe how the fire started, how much damage it caused, and how it was eventually extinguished. The Latin words translated to "which wrought such horrors, is not yet quenched," were added to the end of the inscription on the orders of the Court of the Aldermen in 1681, during the foment of the Popish plot. Text on the east side originally falsely blamed Roman Catholics for the fire. Burning of this Protestant city began and carried on by the treachery and malice of the Popish faction, which prompted Alexander Pope, himself a Catholic, to say of the area, "where London's column, pointing at the skies, like a tall bully, lifts its head and lies." Moral Essays, Epistle 3, line 339, 1733 to 1734. The words blaming Catholics were chiselled out with Catholic emancipation in 1830. The west side of the base displays a scripture by Caius Gabriel Gibber of the destruction of the city, with Charles II and his brother James, the Duke of York, later King James II, surrounded by liberty, architecture and science, giving directions for its restoration. It also gives its name to the nearby London Underground station monument. The first Rebuilding Act, passed in 1669, stipulated that the better to preserve the memory of this dreadful visitation, a column of either brass or stone should be set up on Fish Street Hill, or near the site of Firener's Bakery, where the fire began. Christopher Wren, as Surveyor General of the King's Works, was asked to submit a design. Wren worked with Robert Hooke on the design. It is impossible to disentangle the collaboration between Hooke and Wren, but Hooke's drawings of possible designs for the columns still exist, with Wren's signature on them, indicating his approval of the drawings rather than their authorship. It was not until 1671 that the City Council approved the design, and it took 6 years to complete the 202-foot column. It was 2 more years before the inscription, which had been left to Wren, or to Wren's choice, to decide upon, was set in place, commemorating, with a brazen disregard for the truth, the fact that London rises again, 3 short years complete, that which was considered the work of ages. Hooke's surviving drawings show that several versions of the monument were submitted for consideration. A plain obelisk, a column garnished with tongues of fire, and the fluted Doric column, that was eventually chosen. The real contention came with the problem of what type of ornament to have at the top. Initially, Wren favoured a statue of a phoenix with outstretched wings rising from the ashes. But as the column neared completion, he decided instead on a 15-foot statue either of Charles II or a sword-wielding female to represent a triumphant London, the cost of either being estimated at £1,050. Charles himself disliked the idea of his statue atop a monument and instead preferred a simple copper gilded ball, with flames sprouting from the top, costing a little over £325. But ultimately, it was the design of a flaming gilt bronze urn suggested by Robert Hooke that was chosen. The total cost of the monument was £13,450, 11 shillings and 9 pence, of which £11,300 was paid by the mason contractor Joshua Marshall. He was the master of the Worshipful Company of Masons in 1670. The Edinburgh-born writer James Boswell visited the monument in 1763 to climb the 311 steps, to what was then the highest viewpoint in London. Halfway up, he suffered a panic attack, but persevered and made it to the top, where he found it horrid to be so monstrous away up in the air, so far above London and all its spires. The area around the base of the column, Monument Street, was pedestrianised in 2006 in a £790,000 street improvement scheme. The monument closed in July 2007 for an 18-month £4.5 million refurbishment project and reopened in February 2009. Wren and Hooke built the monument to double up as a scientific instrument. It has a central shaft, meaning for its use as a zenith telescope and for use in gravity and pendulum experiments that connects to an underground laboratory for observers to work, accessible through a hatch in the floor of the present-day ticket booth. Vibrations from the heavy traffic on Fish Hill Street rendered the experimental conditions unsuitable. At the top of the monument, a hinged lid in the urn covers the opening to the shaft. The steps in the shaft of the tower are all 6 inches high, allowing them to be used for barometric pressure studies. More recently, researchers from Queen Mary's University of London used the shaft of the monument stairwell to measure the deformation in hanging wire by twisting and untwisting a wire hanging down the shaft of the stairwell. They were able to detect deformation of at least 9 parts per billion, equivalent to 1 degree twist over the length of a 50-metre wire. During the 2007-2009 refurbishment, a 360-degree panoramic camera was installed on the top of the monument. Updated every minute and running 24 hours a day, it provides a record of the weather, building and ground activity in the city. Now, let's go back and look at the Great Fire itself, for which the monument was built. The Great Fire of London swept through central parts of London from Sunday the 2nd of September to Thursday the 6th of September 1666. The fire gutted the medieval city of London inside the old Roman city wall. It threatened but did not reach the aristocratic district of Westminster, Charles II's Palace of Whitehall, or most of the suburban slums. It destroyed 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, St Paul's Cathedral, and most of the buildings of the city authorities. It is estimated to have destroyed the homes of 70,000 of the city's 80,000 inhabitants. The death toll is unknown, but was traditionally thought to have been relatively small, as only 6 verified deaths were recorded. This reasoning has recently been challenged on the grounds that the deaths of poor or middle-class people were not recorded. Moreover, the heat of the fire may have cremated many victims, leaving no recognisable remains. A melted piece of pottery on display at the Museum of London, found by archaeologists in Pudding Lane, where the fire started, shows that the temperature reached 1,250 degrees centigrade, 2,280 degrees Fahrenheit. The Great Fire started at the bakery or baker's house of Thomas Furner, or Fëanor, on Pudding Lane, shortly after midnight on Sunday the 2nd of September, and spread rapidly west across the City of London. The major firefighting technique of the time was to create firebreaks by means of demolition. This was critically delayed owing to the indecisiveness of the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth. By the time large-scale demolitions were ordered on Sunday night, the wind had already fanned the bakery fire into a firestorm that defeated such measures. The fire pushed north on Monday into the heart of the city. Order in the streets broke down as rumours arose of suspicious foreigners setting fires. The fears of the homeless focused on the French and Dutch, England's enemies in the ongoing Second Anglo-Dutch War. These substantial immigrant groups became victims of lynchings and street violence. On Tuesday, the fire spread over most of the city, destroying St Paul's Cathedral and leaping the River Fleet to threaten King Charles II's court at Whitehall. Coordinated firefighting efforts were simultaneously mobilised. The battle to quench the fire is considered to have been won by two factors. The strong east winds died down, and the Tower of London garrison used gunpowder to create effective firebreaks to halt further spread eastward. The social and economic problems created by the disaster were overwhelming evacuation from London, and the resettlement elsewhere was strongly encouraged by Charles II, who feared a London rebellion against the dispossessed refugees. Despite several radical proposals, London was reconstructed on essentially the same street plan used before the fire. By the 1660s, London was by far the largest city in Britain, estimated at 500,000 inhabitants. However, due to the Great Plague of London during the previous winter, its population had decreased. John Evelyn, contrasting London to the Baroque magnificence of Paris, called it a wooden, northern and inartificial congestion of houses, and expressed alarm about the fire hazards posed by the wood and congestion. By inartificial, Evelyn meant unplanned and makeshift, the result of organic growth and unregulated urban sprawl. London had been a Roman settlement for 4 centuries and had become progressively more crowded inside its defensive city wall. It had also pushed outwards beyond the wall into squalid slums such as Shoreditch, Holborn and Southwark, and had reached far enough to include the independent city of Westminster. Hi there, and thanks so much for listening to this podcast on the history of London. And if you're enjoying this, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up on YouTube. Now, if you want to get more involved with London Visited, don't forget you can join us as a member by going to patreon.com/London Visited with so many different benefits. Or you could purchase a 4K photograph of London from our website, londonvisited.co.uk, both of which support us and keep the channel going. Once again, thanks for listening. And now, back to the podcast. By the late 17th century, the city proper, the area bounded by the city wall and the River Thames, was only a part of London, covering some 700 acres, and home to about 80,000 people, or 1/6 of London's inhabitants. The city was surrounded by a ring of inner suburbs where most Londoners lived. The city was then, as now, the commercial heart of the capital, and was the largest market and busiest port in England, dominated by the trading and manufacturing classes. The aristocracy shunned the city, and lived either in the countryside beyond the slum suburbs, or in the exclusive Westminster district, the modern West End, the site of King Charles II's court at Whitehall. Wealthy people preferred to live at a convenient distance from the traffic-clogged, polluted, unhealthy city, especially after it was hit by a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague in the plague year of 1665. The relationship was often tense between the city and the Crown. The City of London had been a stronghold of republicanism during the Civil War, 1642 to 1651, and the wealthy and economically dynamic capital still had the potential to be a threat to Charles II, as had been demonstrated by several Republican uprisings in London in the early 1660s. The city magistrates were of the generation that had fought in the Civil War and could remember how Charles I's grab for absolute power had led to that national trauma. They were determined to thwart any similar tendencies in his son, and when the Great Fire threatened the city, they refused the offers that Charles made of the soldiers and other resources. Even in such an emergency, the idea of having the unpopular royal troops ordered into the city was political dynamite. By the time that Charles took over command from the ineffectual Lord Mayor, the fire was already out of control. The city was essentially medieval in its street plan, an overcrowded warren of narrow, winding, cobbled alleys. It had experienced several major fires before 1666, the most recent in 1632. Buildings with wood and roofing with thatch had been prohibited for centuries, but these cheap materials continued to be used. The only major stone-built area was the wealthy centre of the city, where the mansions of the merchants and the brokers stood on spacious lots, surrounded by an inner ring of overcrowded poorer parishes, whose every inch of building space was used to accommodate the rapidly growing population. These parishes contained workplaces, many of which were fire hazards, foundries, smithies, glaziers, which were technically illegal in the city, but tolerated in practice. The human habitations were crowded to bursting point, Intermingled with these sources of heat, sparks and pollution, and their construction increased the fire risk. The typical 6 or 7 story timbered London tenement houses had jetties, projecting upper floors. They had a narrow footprint at ground level, but maximised the use of their land by encroaching on the street. As a contemporary observer put it, with the gradually increasing size of their upper stories, the fire hazard was well perceived when the top jetties all but met across the narrow alleys. In 1661, Charles II issued a proclamation forbidding overhanging windows and jetties, but this was largely ignored by the local government. Charles's next sharper message in 1665 warned of the risk of fire from the narrowness of the streets and authorised both imprisonment of builders and demolition of dangerous buildings. It too had little impact. Wattle and daub was common building material at the time. Research by the fire brigades showed that well-made new wattle and daub was strongly fire resistant, but old, neglected wattle and daub with patches of daub flaked off would expose patches of wattle that readily caught fire. The riverfront was important in the development of the Great Fire. The Thames offered water for firefighting and the chance of escape by boat, but the poorer districts along the riverfront had stores and cellars and combustibles which had increased the fire risk. All along the wharves, the rickety wooden tenements and tar paper shacks of the poor were shoehorned amongst old paper buildings and the most combustible matter of tar, pitch, hemp, rosin and flax, which was all laid up thereabouts. London was also full of black powder, especially along the riverfront. Much of it was left in the homes of private citizens from the days of the English Civil War, as the former members of Oliver Cromwell's new model army still retained their muskets and the powder to which to load them. 500 to 600 tons of powder was stored in the Tower of London. The ship chandlers along the wharves also held large stocks, stored in wooden barrels. Fires were common in the crowded wood-built city with its open fireplaces, candles, ovens and stores of combustibles. There was no police or fire brigade to call, but London's local militia, known as the trained bands, was available for general emergencies, at least in principle, and watching for fire was one of the jobs of the watch, 1,000 watchmen or bellmen who patrolled the cities at night. Self-reliant community procedures were in place for dealing with fires, and they were usually effective. Public-spirited citizens would be alerted to a dangerous house fire by peals on the church bells and would congregate hastily to fight the fire. The methods available for this relied on demolition and water. By law, the tower of every parish church had to hold equipment for these efforts: long ladders, leather buckets, axes and fire hooks for pulling down buildings. Sometimes taller buildings were levelled quickly and effectively by means of controlled gunpowder explosions. This drastic method of creating firebreaks was increasingly used towards the end of the Great Fire. The modern historians believe this is what finally won the struggle. London Bridge was the only physical connection between the city and the south side of the River Thames, and was itself covered with houses. It had been noted as a death trap in the fire of 1632, and by dawn on Sunday these houses were burning. Samuel Pepys observed the conflagration from the Tower of London and recorded great concern for friends living on the bridge. There were fears that the flames would cross London Bridge to threaten the borough of Southwark on the south bank. But this danger was averted by an open space between buildings on the bridge, which acted as a firebreak. The 18-foot, 5.5 metre high Roman wall enclosing the city put the fleeing homeless at risk of being shut into the inferno. Once the riverfront was on fire and the escape route cut off by boat, the only exits were from the 8 gates in the wall. During the first couple of days, few people had any notion of fleeing the burning city altogether. They would remove what they could carry of their belongings to their nearest safe houses. In many cases the parish church or the precincts of St. Paul's Cathedral, only to have to move again hours later. Some moved their belongings and themselves 4 and 5 times in a single day. The perception of a need to get beyond the walls took root only late on the Monday. And then there were near-panic scenes on the narrow gates as distraught refugees tried to get out with their bundles, carts, horses and wagons. The critical factor which frustrated firefighting efforts was the narrowness of the streets. Even under normal circumstances, the mix of carts, wagons and pedestrians in the undersized alleys were subject to frequent traffic jams and gridlock. During the fire, the passages were additionally blocked by refugees camping in them amongst their rescue belongings, or escaping outwards, away from the centre of destruction, as demolition teams and fire engine crews struggled in vain to move in towards it. Demolishing the houses downwind of a dangerous fire was often an effective way of containing the destructions by means of fire hooks or explosives. This time, however, demolition was fatally delayed for hours by the Lord Mayor's lack of leadership and failure to give the necessary orders. By the time the orders came directly from the king to spare no houses, the fire had devoured many more houses and the demolition workers could no longer get through the crowded streets. The use of water to extinguish the fire was also frustrated. In principle, water was available from a system of elm pipes which supplied 30,000 houses via a high water tower at Cornhill, filled from the river at high tide, and also via a reservoir of Hertfordshire spring water in Islington. It was often possible to open a pipe near a burning building and connect it to a hose to spray on a fire or fill buckets. Further, Pudding Lane was close to the river. Theoretically, all the lanes from the river up to the bakery and adjoining buildings should have been manned with double rows of firefighters passing full buckets up to the fire and empty buckets back down to the river. This did not happen, or at least was no longer happening by the time that Pepys viewed the fire from the river at mid-morning on the Sunday. Pepys comments in his diary that nobody was trying to put it out, but instead they fled from it in fear, hurrying to remove their goods and leave all to the fire. The flames crept towards the riverfront with little interference from the overwhelmed community, and soon torched the flammable warehouses along the wharves. The resulting conflagration cut off the firefighters from the immediate water supply from the river and set alight to the water wheels under London Bridge, which pumped water to Cornhill Water Tower. The direct access to the river and the supply of piped water failed together. London possessed advanced firefighting technology in the form of fire engines, which had been used in earlier large-scale fires. However, unlike the useful fire hooks, these large pumps had rarely proved flexible or functional enough to make much difference. Only some of them had wheels, others were mounted onto wheelless sleds. They had to be brought a long way, tended to arrive too late and had limited reach, with spouts but no delivery houses. On this occasion, an unknown number of fire engines were either wheeled or dragged through the streets, some across the city. The piped water had already failed, which they were designed to use, but parts of the riverbank could still be reached. Gangs of men tried desperately to manoeuvre the engines right up to the river to fill their reservoirs, and several of the engines toppled into the Thames. The heat from the flames by then was too great for the remaining engines to get within a useful distance. They could not even get into Pudding Lane. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of our in-depth look at the Great Fire of London and the Monument of London. Please come back and join us for part 2 next week. Whichever podcast service you use to listen to this, please do subscribe and get updates on new shows, and please leave us some feedback. Please let me know any places you'd like us to feature in future podcasts by emailing me directly on londonvisited@gmail.com or contacting us on Twitter @LondonVisited, Instagram @LondonVisited, or Facebook @TheLondonVisited. Don't forget to visit our YouTube channel, London Visited, to see videos covering this place and so many others across London. Thanks for listening, and I really hope you've enjoyed our podcast, and we'll see you soon.